Hello YouTube! As you might know, the goal of hypertrophy training is to get as much result from as little work as possible in an effort to save us both time and energy put into the gym. And when most people hear that, they automatically think of minimalism, which is the practice of cutting down the workload by reducing sets, days, and exercise selection to keep only the essential portions of the program. As you might know, I'm not a big fan of minimalism because the issue is that while this practice does absolutely save a lot of time and energy, it does so at the detriment of results. And while some people are fine getting only 80% of the gains if it means putting in only half of the work, I personally believe in a more maximized approach. The issue is that I never really took the time to explain that approach to you guys. Sure, I made programs, sure, I made a gazillion videos about programming, but these are puzzle pieces that are just scattered all throughout the channel. There is no definitive video that explains the way I approach bodybuilding, and therefore I seek to correct this mistake today. So as you've come to understand, I believe in a more maximized approach. The issue, however, with a maximized approach is that you can end up doing too much. It's both sides of the spectrum. Minimalists don't do enough and maximalists do too much. And both sides are wrong in my opinion because both sides are either wasting efforts or not putting in enough efforts. But it's also more complex than that. It's possible to have a maximized program that has you do so many exercises and so many reps and sets that you sacrifice on intensity, and when that happens to me, you're also shooting yourself in the foot because you got to a point where you are not approaching training with the proper intensity, which can be as detrimental as not doing enough or being too intense. And this is where the 85% rule comes into play. This training philosophy promotes the idea of getting less out of more without sacrificing on results. To do so, instead of thinking about doing less, we are going to think about doing just enough, which can be accomplished by following the simple guidelines that I will be presenting to you now. As a heads up, this video is going to be a lecture about programming. I'm of course going to be as lively as possible. I will introduce real examples. I won't just be reading to you guys a script because there is no point in that. But for some of you, it might be a little bit too complex, which is why I actually put the entirety of the method in the pinned comments. That way, if you don't understand a certain point, you can get to that pinned comment in particular, look at the passage you didn't understand, and actually try to read through it, which should make it much easier for you to actually get what's going on. I will also be mentioning the topics of fatigue accumulation, recovery, minimalism, etc., HIT in this video, but only in passing. So I might not even actually name drop them. I'm just going to reference these practices, but I'm not going to take the time to explain to you once again why they don't work because I've already done that in the past. And if you want more resources to understand the concepts that are going to be present in this video, you can actually go check the description. All of the videos can be found there. But I promise you that this video is not going to be confusing. I'm going to make it as straightforward as possible, as simple as possible, because in truth, the 85% rule is not complex. Do not get panicked if you don't understand a certain passage. Just go back, listen to it again. I guarantee you that it is not complicated at all. I always try to make programming as simple as possible, and this is what I came up with. This is the simplest way I can explain bodybuilding training to you guys. And for all of the people that still struggle with evolving rep ranges, this video is also going to give you clear examples on how to apply evolving rep ranges in your program because the 85% rule and evolving rep ranges go hand in hand. They function within the same system. And the same goes for deloads. If you still don't quite understand why I say that deloads are useless for bodybuilding, this video is going to give you a clear answer as well. So first and foremost, why 85%? Well, that number is going to make sense the longer you listen to me, but the original 85% rule was coined by Dan Go. And when he created the rule, he coined it for a more general athletic approach to fitness. So it wasn't for bodybuilding. I want to make that clear. This is my original theory. It's just that I looked at the way he articulated his thoughts around the 85% number, and I realized that my method was exactly the same but applied to hypertrophy training. So I decided to take the name because I am pretty decent at creating ideas and methodologies, but when it comes to actually finding names for them, I suck. So I adopted the 85% name because it is absolutely perfect for my version, which is for bodybuilding. But understand that instead of technical proficiency, the goal of the method here is to create a system that promotes constant hypertrophy with as little work as possible. So the methodology changes, but the mindset is still the same. And this is why, as I said, we are doing less. Any superfluous work gets cut, keeping only quality sets and reps, which I argue is the only way to truly maximize. The other way would be to just do more and more and more and more, and as you will come to understand if you attempt that, eventually it stops working because you end up doing, again, superfluous work and you only have one body. Work takes energy and eventually it becomes detrimental. This is why I wanted to create this rule. I've come to understand that with my influence, minimalism has taken a hit, and that's great because bodybuilding suffers from minimalism. But I also don't want to see the pendulum swinging all the way to the other side of maximalized approaches. So I want to stop it in the middle, and this is what the 85% rule is doing. I am stopping the pendulum. So in practice, this doesn't mean that we'll always stay away from putting in 100% effort, one side of the pendulum, when we train, but rather that we'll try to be as close to 85% as possible most of the time. 85% is an arbitrary number. The idea of that number is to put in your head the notion that we want to be balanced. But as you come to understand, it's not 50. Why? Because 50%, when related to percentages for lifting, is irrelevant. So it was to make sure that I didn't just end up with people doing half-assed work. 85% still puts in your head the idea that we are still close to 100%, which is why this number isn't a training percentage. I don't want people to start thinking that I'm just telling you guys to train at 85% all the time. That is absolutely not the point. Instead, the number represents the average rate of intensity that you must be putting into your lifts, which will also dictate the amount of fatigue you will be accumulating, which in turn will decide your training frequency and number of sets and reps per week, which correlate directly to the amount of volume you will do. Yes, these are a ton of variables and values, but all these values are connected, all of them, and they all stem from the 85% rule. So as long as you understand the rule, you will understand every single variable that is connected to the rule. I guarantee you that. But of course, I will be presenting the way each of these variables interacts with the rule so as to make sure that you get the entire map in your head. I also want to make clear that just because I use 85% doesn't mean that you should never go to failure. What you will do is you'll avoid the type of non-productive fatigue that going to failure on certain lifts or with certain rep ranges can create. To demonstrate this, we have to look at what the 85% rule applied to percentage-based lifting would look like. If you do one rep max, for example, you just experienced 100% intensity for very little volume. Obviously, we want to avoid this as much as possible. So in this case, I would tell you, yes, don't go to 100% and don't go to failure. Why? Because the rep range you selected to go to failure is bad. You are falling outside of the 85% range. Our goal is not to reach high levels of intensity, but to accumulate quality volume, which also doesn't mean that we don't want intensity. I hope that you understand this. We train closer to failure, not to reach failure, but to get those high quality reps that precede it. That makes a ton of sense. When you do a set of 10 on the bench, your goal is not to fail. You're not benching so that you can get to that 10th rep and fail it. You bench to get close to it. And the reps, the closer they get to that failure, the more relevant they become, and therefore the more potent they are for hypertrophy. If we were to isolate that rep where you failed, that rep is not that interesting. The reason why you failed is because you did interesting and quality work beforehand. This is something to keep in mind. This is the logic behind trying to always stay to proximity with failure. But as you've come to understand, to be able to apply this, you have to do reps. So doing 1, 2, 3 reps is going to be counterindicated, which also means that the entire idea of percentage-based lifting becomes much more complex because now you have to apply it to a multitude of values instead of one. It's very easy to apply percentages to one rep max. It's one number. So it's easy to say it's 60%. If it's 10 numbers because it's 10 reps, now it's harder because, as you have understood, I hope, not every rep of a 10 rep set is going to be at 85%. But we're going to get back to that. This is only one aspect of percentage-based lifting you must understand to be able to understand how to apply the 85% rule. The first one being that not everyone is going to have the same ability to rep close to their 100%. It's something that people struggle with because it's a question of perspective and individual disposition. My 90% is not your 90%, even though technically they're the same number. Please do keep that in mind. Intensity tends to really confuse people for some reason, but to give you an example that is easy to understand, some people will only be able to do 2 reps at 90%, and some people might be able to do 4. I know that the calculators that are online nowadays with the percentages and the RPEs mess with people's head because they give absolute numbers like, oh, you should be able to do 4 reps with that percentage of your 1 rep max. It simply doesn't work like that. You will find that some individuals can rep more and some can rep less, and usually that's also correlated with the idea that some individuals can do 1 rep maxes that do not correlate with their 2 rep maxes. Again, this is individual disposition, but as a bodybuilder, as someone training for size, your goal should, of course, to get that number as high as possible. You want to skew your strength towards rep strength as opposed to 1 rep max strength. I understand that the two are correlated. I'm not saying they're not. Of course, if you up your 3 rep max, your 1 rep max will go up. But any powerlifter with their salt will tell you that a 1 rep max is a skill. Likewise, a 10 rep max is also a skill. It's a quality of the body you must develop. Luckily for us, for bodybuilding, a 10 rep max correlates more with muscle mass. A 1 rep max correlates more with nervous system activation. Does it mean that you can do 1 rep max without muscles? No. Does it mean that you can do a 10 rep max without using your nervous system? No, but it's a different value and it's skewed in a different direction. This is what you must keep in mind. This is not a video about strength and size, but again, since it seems to confuse people, this is how you have to understand percentage-based lifting to be able to understand the 85% rule. Now, how exactly do you skew your strength towards rep strength? Well, it's very simple. You practice it. So the 85% rule stipulates that you are going to be training with higher rep ranges. This is going to correlate to higher volume, but also the ability to get better at it and therefore to get more volume over time. And this is why most people training for looks should stick to the 6 to 12 rep range. The lower extremities being 3 to 4 reps, never going lower than this, and the higher extremities being 15 to 20. The 85% rule applies also here. We want to have a number in the middle and we want to gravitate around that number, never going so far that you go outside of that number. And by sticking to these rep ranges, we'll also ensure that you always train with an intensity of 60 to 90%, which tends to be correlated with the highest amount of productive work. This does not mean, however, and I repeat myself, that you stick to 85%. That will defeat the purpose. We want the global work to be around 85%. You could do 95% one day and 65% the other day. It still balances out. This is still the point. The bulk of the work needs to be around 85%, not 85% itself. If you stick to 85%, you are going to run a completely different system, a system, might I add, that is going to fail you because your intensity is never going to fluctuate. So that was for the one thing to understand about percentage-based lifting. The second thing is what I mentioned previously, is that you want to keep in mind that intensity evolves throughout the set. If you decide to do 8 reps of squat at 75%, only the first rep will be represented by that number, with the second being 77%, the third 80%, etc., until you reach failure, which is in this scenario 100%. You cannot go beyond 100% because 100% represents the number at which point you fail. You also understand by this token that you might not want to hit 100%. You might want to be around 100%. So maybe stopping at 95% or even 90% is a better idea. This is where the notion of reps in reserve comes into play. But we also don't want to be so far away from failure that we do irrelevant work. So the goal is to select a range that is going to allow us to do as many reps as possible, close to failure, by selecting a first rep that reflects a high enough percentage in order to accumulate as much quality volume as possible. And this is also why we don't want to go above 15 or 20 reps. You understand that if you select a weight that correlates to a 20% intensity or percentage for the first rep, you are never going to get close to failure. It's absolutely impossible because the more reps you all do, the less intensity increases per rep and the harder it is to approach failure. So you don't want to go too high with too low of a rep range, and you don't want to go too low with too high of a rep range. Again, you want to be in the middle, you want to follow the 85% rule. And if you can understand the 2 points I just presented to you that come from percentage-based lifting, you also begin to understand the benefits of that rule. It gives you a framework to understand what constitutes quality work without restricting your ability to manipulate volume and intensity. So, for example, if you needed to promote progression, you would up the intensity, but you would know when to stop. And if you wanted more volume, you would know that you can up the reps and the sets, but you would also know what the limit is. For now, we've established the limit for the reps. You will see that the limit for the sets is explained later. But overall, this is what the 85% rule does in relation to your rep range and to your rep selection. It gives you a striking zone, and it never allows you to go outside of the striking zone because you will know immediately if you enter an irrelevant rep range via either too much intensity, too much volume, or too little of both. And if you apply this rule for your rep ranges, you will automatically be able to also understand how to apply progressive overload to said rep ranges because the two go together. You will not be able to progress using the rule I just gave you if you don't also apply the type of progressive overload I'm going to explain to you right now. So since this method promotes both the values of volume and intensity at the same time and don't really allow you to just completely forgive one or just completely slash the other, you also come to realize that the more reps and sets you are able to do, the more weight you are able to put on the bar, and the two are going to evolve alongside one another. If one value stops going up, the value of volume for example, there's a chance that you're going to store in weight on the bar and vice versa. The two are interconnected. This is how the progressive overload application of the 85% rule would function. Essentially, you will do more reps and sets to be able to add weight on the bar, and you will strive to get more reps and sets with that new additional load on the bar until you can justify another jump in weight. So essentially, you should aim to work hard enough so that your current 85% of perceived exhaustion becomes the 70% by doing more sets and reps with the same weight, then adapt the weight by going up so that the percentage of perceived exhaustion also goes up to 85%, which would most likely require you to step back down in reps and sets, at which point you slowly build back up the volume by adding more sets and reps that you just took out until you're back at 70% again, at which point, what is the next step? The next step would be up in weight, take down sets, take down reps, and then repeat that process over and over again. This is how you progress. But make sure that you do not do it in reverse. Do not get to 75% of perceived exhaustion, then keep adding more reps and sets without touching the weight, because that would simply result in more volume accumulation without the intensity, meaning that you will be lacking in that variable. And as I said previously, this most likely will result in no actual hypertrophic benefits or gains because the system is now completely unbalanced. Now you are applying the 50% rule because the more reps and sets you do, the lower the percentage goes. So you go from 70% to 60% to 50%, which is not the point. We always want to be at 85%, understanding that it's not possible. So we only allow a dip downwards or upwards, and then we rinse and repeat back up. We go back to 85% and we continue that over and over again. You also understand by that token that it's possible to move from 85% to 95%. And how would you do that? Well, you would reduce the sets and the reps even more and you would up the intensity more. But as I said previously, we do not want to do that. Why? Because this approach would prioritize strength progression over volume accumulation. And for bodybuilding's sake, we are going to stick with more volume. We don't neglect intensity, but intensity is a mean to make sure that the volume is quality and to push volume upward. This is how you must apply this mindset. This is why this is called the 85% rule and not the 95% rule. And since the goal is to keep our effort output around 85%, this also means that adding sets and reps must be done conservatively. So you first add reps with the evolving rep range, then sets, again using the same principle, which you can add on the same day or on another day, and then you add weight. This is also known as step loading. But all of this must always be done in small quantities. Why? Because we always want to stay close to 85%. So if you add too much at once, you are going to create too much fluctuation away from 85%, which again is needed for progression. You cannot stay at 85%, but if you strain away from 85% too much, this could become damaging for your progression and for the stability of your training. So if you need an example, you start with a 200-pound close grip bench press, and you're able to do 3 sets for 7 reps, then 6 reps, then 5 reps. Your goal should be to get to a point where you can get 10 reps on your first set and still be able to get at least 6 reps on your last set, even if a 4th one has been added. Only once you get to that point do you add more weight on the bar. Practically, this means that you will fluctuate between high volume valleys with slightly lower intensity and low volume valleys with slightly higher intensity. But the fluctuation is minimal compared to mesocycles. If you look at a mesocycle of people who run strength blocks or hypertrophy blocks, their workload and their intensity does this. There's a lot of fluctuation. For bodybuilding, we want to avoid that as much as possible for reasons that are fairly obvious. If you have massive increases in intensity, something else has to decrease, and that something else is volume. We never want to sacrifice volume as a bodybuilder, but we also don't want to just end up with pure volume, because pure volume without intensity becomes entirely meaningless. So we always want the fluctuation to be small. And the benefit of that method also is, of course, that because you never actually have massive dips in fatigue, you also never have to take a deload, because you never get to a point where you are so low that you need a period of stabilization to be able to go back up again, which is the issue with the type of programming methods that I see nowadays for bodybuilding that tend to just try to copy systems from powerlifting, but powerlifting and bodybuilding are not the same sports, and this is why I wanted to put this video out there for you guys to be able to actually show you the way I believe it should be done. And the beauty of this method is that you never fail. With linear periodization, it will often happen that you will go up in weight only to find out that you simply cannot hit the number of reps you are supposed to. So you're doing your reps, but because you are supposed to take frequent jumps in weight, oftentimes what happens is that you spike, but you cannot handle the amount of volume needed. And usually it's because you're supposed to replicate the same performance you did last week for the same amount of reps and sets, but with more weights. How does that make any sense? It only makes sense if you were actually able to lift more last week, or if you somehow adapted to the point that you now can actually boost your performance to that level. But at some point, we all know that this stops occurring. It stops being possible to add 5 pounds on the bar, 10 pounds on the bar every time you lift. And when that happens, what do? Well, you can resort to another method. And the other method I'm offering for you guys is this step loading I'm talking about. And the reason I think it's very important to be able to separate yourself from linear periodization at some point is because you will eventually run into what I call 5x5 syndrome, which tends to lead to plateaus, regression, and frustration, and can really sign the death of your career, quote unquote, in aesthetics or bodybuilding, because you will think that the issue is with your body when in reality the issue is with the method. I'm not saying that 5x5 doesn't work. I just think that for bodybuilding, I don't really see why this method in particular should be preferred over something with much more flexibility like the 85% rule. Because if you actually espouse this method of progression, you will find that progressive overload becomes much easier, and it stops becoming something that gives you anxiety. You are going to stop worrying about Can I actually add weight the next time, or is it going to fail? Am I going to have to plateau? Am I going to have to go back down in weight? No, with step loading, you are guaranteed to hit your reps because you have built up enough volume with the previous load to ensure that the next step will be successful. This is my mindset when approaching bodybuilding. In my opinion, it is best to take 2 steps forward rather than 3 steps forward than 2 steps back. But I would also argue that it is best to take 1 step forward rather than 3 steps forward than 2 steps back. Even though technically you gained no steps whatsoever, and you could tell me, well, the two are the same. I disagree because the first method, the one that I promote, cultivates momentum and doesn't breed frustration. It takes the pressure off of you and it gets you away from an all or nothing mindset. I'm sure that you have dealt with that mindset before of going to the gym and thinking to yourself, I have to hit this weight for this amount of reps, and if I fail, the entire training session was for nothing. The 85% rule doesn't function like this. And even if you so happen to fail and to not get the reps that you want or the weight that you want, as long as the step forward was conservative, the failure is not going to be catastrophical. You're going to miss on 1 rep, but you will never, almost never have to deload and go back down in weight, which would be a step backward, and it's what we want to avoid as much as possible. If you did 10 reps, then 9 reps, then 8, then 8, so for 4 sets on close grip bench with 200 pounds, do you think that there is a way for you to not be able to hit 7 reps, then 6 reps, then 6 reps with 205 pounds? Do you think that logically it would make sense for you to not be able to hit that weight? The answer is no, because the jump in weight was small and you proved yourself that you have the ability to actually manage that step by the amount of volume that you accumulated previously. And this is why I push evolving sets and reps so aggressively. It's because they promote volume accumulation and intensity progression by stabilizing the workload long enough for you to not only get used to the weight, but also to get the full benefit of it, as opposed to rushing to move on to the next number, which so many progression schemes tend to do. They want you to get as strong as possible, as fast as possible. I do not function like this. 85% rule. I'm not going to maximize your strength progression because doing so would minimize the volume accumulation. Instead, I'm going to keep you at 85%. This is the mantra and this is the mindset I want to impress upon you. Because the more time you can spend lifting a weight that challenges you without failing outside of a relevant intensity window, the better. And this is why we try to stay around 85%. There's not really a reason for us to go outside of it or to try to go way higher than it, because it is still relevant work and it also promotes our ability to stay for as long as possible using a weight that is going to make us grow. When do we go up in weight? When we want to go up in weight? No. When the weight stops challenging us and we have dipped down to 70%. This is when you go up in weight. This is still the 85% rule. Your goal is not to get stronger. Your goal is to get back up to 85% of perceived exhaustion. This sounds like it's the same thing, but it's not, because it shifts your mindset away from strength towards I want to be able to stay within a rep range that is going to actually challenge my body and make my muscles grow. And I can tell you for a fact that this, for aesthetics, makes all the difference in the world. Because while it does slow down strength progression, it greatly enhances hypertrophy because the amount of volume you experience is greater. I'm not going to get into it too much, but if you understand what I just told you, you also understand that it's possible to take 2 lifters to make them grow on the bench, for example, and for the first lifter to reach a 250 bench much faster than the second lifter, but the second lifter will get much bigger than the first one, even if they don't get as strong as them. What is the difference between the two? Is it genetics? No, it's the scheme they applied to progress. One of them wanted strength. Guess what they got? Strength. And when the second one gets to 250, he will be much bigger than the first when the first got to 250. And it could also very well be that all throughout their progression and their journey, the second lifter will be bigger and the first lifter will be stronger. Aim to get stronger, yes, but aim to get stronger for the right reasons. And if you follow the 85% rule, you will be within the framework that will give you the right reasons. If we do favor volume, it's because volume is the variable that is correlated the highest with the ability to accumulate the workload. That is pretty much this. If getting stronger and bumping up the intensity via weight on the bar was the best way to grow your number in terms of tonnage, I would follow this. But as we know, it doesn't. Why? If you had 5 pounds on the bar on your bench, great, you gained 5 pounds. If you add a set of 10 reps, you gain 10 reps. If it's 200 pounds on the bar, you gain 2,000 pounds of tonnage, as opposed to 5 by 10, 50, 2,050. Which one is going to give you more workload? The 2,000 pound increase. So this is why volume is always the metric that we favor as bodybuilders. But as I explained to you with the graph of intensity and volume, volume just by itself is going to fail you at some point. Then there is also the matter of fatigue management. Because even if the progression scheme is good, it will fail if the recovery strategy attached to it isn't on point. This means that someone who trains twice a week will not apply the 85% rule the same way someone who trains 5 times a week would. It is always the demand that creates the training and not the other way around. Meaning that recovery can never be a rogue variable. You cannot just guesstimate recovery. You cannot do a session and think, okay, well, depending on how much this beats me up, I'm going to then decide the next time I train that muscle. This is the best way to have a training program that is completely out of whack, because now it becomes the training that dictates what you do and not you who dictates the training, and we cannot let that happen. This means that if your session leaves you unable to lift for longer than you expected, it is poor planning on your part because you ended up accumulating more fatigue that you could handle at the detriment of regular stimulus. And this is why when looking at the 85% rule, frequency is key, because frequency must be regarded as a recovery schedule. The 85% rule will therefore give you a good idea of which frequency schedule makes sense in terms of recovery and which don't. This means that there exists no such thing as an optimal frequency to train a muscle. I want to make that clear. The 85% rule, even though the name looks like a hard number, is not an absolute rule. Instead, we are going to define the optimal frequency as one that allows you to justify the amount of work you will be doing with the recovery time you have allocated. You have previously decided, based on previous knowledge about your body, that this amount of work should result in this amount of recovery that then is followed up by another session. And if it doesn't match, then this means that your application of the 85% rule was improper and you have to go back to the whiteboard and correct it. Again, based on the information that your body gave you. When you fall, when you can go up in weight, when you have to regress in volume, all of these are indications that at some point you did something wrong. Go back, correct that mistake, and you will see that your progression is going to be fixed. That is as simple as that. So for example, and this is something I'm going to repeat later, if you train lats super hard on Monday, then you train them again on Tuesday and you realize that you're not performance, you can do as much volume. This is an indication, a clear one of course, that you should have rested longer. It is very simple. This is the gist of it. This is what the 85% rule is. So if we extrapolate that rule in terms of frequency and fatigue management, this means, for example, that, again, to take the example of the lats, if you train them at 65% on Monday, then rest 5 days until you train them again. Logically, applying the same principle, you understand that you most likely rested too long. The amount of work on Monday did not justify the amount of recovery. So if you correct it, you would bring that session upward in the week, earlier in the week, and you would most likely end up running lats again on Wednesday, maybe even on Tuesday. The 85% rule is not a shrinking rule, it's not an expanding rule, it's a management rule. So it modifies based on your needs. Now, understand that because these are still hard numbers, there's always a way to argue that there must exist an optimal frequency. And so people would tell you that it's 48 hours. So if you apply the 85% rule to 48 hours, this would mean that you would have to find a percentage to be able to hit the muscles every 48 hours. I don't necessarily disagree with that. It's just that I don't like the idea of ending up with an absolute number in terms of days to train in the week, because that will also correlate with an optimal quote-unquote amount of sets and reps. And it would also entail and promote the idea that this number would be the best for everyone, regardless of individual predisposition, regardless of training experience, regardless of state of fatigue. To me, this is why it cannot exist. This is why optimal quote-unquote training and optimal applications of programming cannot be taken seriously, is because they fail to take into account the individual and they remove the agency from the individual. So instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to make sure that the values match. Okay, sure, maybe you would make better gains if you trained lats at 87% on Tuesday, then again at 77% on Thursday, right? Okay, maybe, but we don't care about that. What I care instead is that if you decided to train your lats at 80% on Tuesday, that you give yourself enough time to recover, then train them again whenever possible. This is what I worry about, because to me, this is a realistic application of the 85% rule, as opposed to, in a sense, a fantasized application of it that would rely on hard math and calculations, which in the real world, times and times again, fail. Reality is not what you put on a piece of paper. Your program needs to function in the gym. It's not enough to write it down, and you will find that if you attempt to be optimal and to use the 85% rule to calculate the perfect frequency or the perfect amount of sets and reps, times and times again, when you attempt it in the gym, it's going to fail because your body is not perfect, your recovery fluctuates. So instead, we always stick with the flexible approach, and the flexible approach, as I said, is this one. It's the one where the values simply match. We make the values match, and this is enough for us to progress. This makes it a question of balance. It's fine to dig deep. It's fine to go at 99% if you want. Absolutely. As long as it's not too often, because if it's too often, you're going to quickly find out that your ability to work frequently is going to disappear into thin air, because your recovery periods will become longer and longer, at which point are the values really matching, and if they match, can you justify them matching? This is also because I hope that the people who are going to watch this video and apply it will have, in a sense of logic. Yes, you can make this rule work by working once a week, but is it really optimal in terms of you, in terms of your ability to train? If your answer is yes and you like HIT, by all means do it. But I think that if you are real with yourself and you're not deluding yourself too much, by trying to stick to this tendency to try to match values, you will naturally be skewed towards an amount of frequency that is going to be more balanced in a sense. So the extremes will be taken care of. The once every 10 days and the 10 times a week will be taken care of, because it is very, very hard to make the values match by following the 85% rule and trying to be as extreme as the examples I just gave you. What we always want to keep in mind is whether or not the extra workload we do will produce results, or if we just train for the sake of training. If you compare someone who gives 100% 3 times a week, it could very well be that this person would benefit from training 5 times a week at 85% instead. Even by doing similar amounts of work, they are likely to see better results. Likewise, someone who trains 6 times a week at 70% could benefit from training 4 times a week at 90%. In the first case, in the case of the person who was doing 3 times a week and then moved to 5 times a week, they are doing more relevant work. And in the second case, the person that went from 6 times a week to 4 times a week, they are doing less irrelevant work. But in both cases, they are applying the 85% rule. They are doing less. The first guy is doing less intensity, and the second guy is doing less volume. They both balanced out their training. But at the end of the day, the result is the same. The two gained more. This is the 85% rule. If you have ever watched me criticize a program, and when I slash things or add things, this is how I think. I balance it. Like one would balance the budget, I balance the program. When I make a program, if you ever run one of my programs, guess what? This is what I follow. This is the logic of the program, the 85% rule. This is how I balance intensity, volume, recovery, frequency, all of these variables. Once you understand this, you can program the same way I do. I'm not telling you to do it because I believe, as I said, that the 85% rule applies differently based on the person that applies it, because my 85% is not your 85%. I'm giving you these rules because I think they're a good framework. And once you have the framework, you can build the machine of your own. You can build whatever you want with it. It is up to you. The key is to settle on a schedule that promotes stable performance by avoiding rep ranges that will redline the body and require a long break to recover, as well as avoiding set selections that have you retake irrelevant weights, as this represents extra work that yields no result. This is, of course, me mentioning again the percentage lifting portion of this video. I don't want to repeat myself. It's just to be able to show to you that all of these variables connect with one another. The percentage-based lifting and the fatigue management and the recovery schedule, all of that is interconnected. If you understand one, you understand the others. This is as simple as that. Now, all of that is nice and all, but if you're new to the 85% rule, how exactly will you know, for example, if you're doing too much? Because sure, I can tell you times and times again that it would just make sense, but at this point, it makes sense to me because I've been using it for so long. And since it's really an instinctive way to train, I also want you to give you weapons at first to be able to see with your eyes the signs that point to you doing something wrong. So for example, using the 85% rule, how do you know if you're overtraining? Well, it's simple enough. You're going to start seeing adverse effects caused directly by the superfluous workload. So the amount of work that you do is too high, and because it is too high, certain things happen to you that are easy to pinpoint. For example, performance goes down. So you lose reps and sets. This is a sign that you are going too high. You are above the 85% rule because you are not able to replicate effort. This is not normal. For a powerlifter who fluctuates, it is to go back down in strength and then up in strength because they peak. For a bodybuilder, no. If you could bench 250 this week and next week you can only touch 240, something will happen, and this something is a fluctuation downward in terms of strength. Strength never fluctuates downward. The only thing that fluctuates downward is the reps and the sets. It's the volume. Why? Because we allow it to dip as we go up in weight. But the weight itself never moves. Okay? Keep in mind that the weight on the bar never moves. What pushes tonnage forward is this variation of reps and sets. But of course, if you wanted to hit 10 reps, for example, and last week you hit 9 and you can only get 7, this also points to a problem. Even though you can still lift the same weight, your ability to replicate the effort diminished. So this is also an issue with recovery. I just want you to know that this is less severe. It's less of a red flag per se. And the issue, of course, if that happens to you, is that it is a sign that the muscle is under-recovered. And not only does it mean that you're not going to get as many benefits from the supercompensation as you would otherwise, it also means that your ability to perform will be subpar, and therefore the quality of the volume you will be accumulating with that muscle is also going to be subpar. So this is not what we want. But for undertraining, it's slightly different because, as you understand, going above 85% is bad, but going below 85% too much is also bad. And usually when that happens, what you will find is you will not find that your performance suffered that much, meaning that weight on the bar is going to stay the same or even go up. Some people report strength exploding when they take a long break. This is why so many people like deloads. This is also why I tell people not to deload, is because we don't really care about weight going up if it correlates with a lower ability to accumulate volume, or it correlates with an entire week where you accumulated no volume. You cannot justify it. In the realm of bodybuilding, it's not justifiable. I'm not going to get into details. I made a full video about deload. You can go check it out. But in this case, if you undertrain, what you will find instead is that your ability to match previous volume goals or to recover from said volume is going to be impacted. So this is where your eye has to be. It's on the ability to get volume throughout the session. And if you manage to get to that point, if you manage to always be around 85%, never lower, never higher, or with slight fluctuations, what you're going to find is that the 85% rule is going to keep you in a state of flow. A state of flow which is the perfect balance between overtraining, which is represented by anxiety on the graph I'm showing you right now, and undertraining, which is represented by boredom. If training is too easy, you get bored and you see no results, and if training is too hard, you get stressed out and overworked. But if you manage to be just in the middle, if you manage to be in that flow state, what you're going to find is that what used to be your 85% intensity soon is going to feel like 70%, at which point you can go up in weight. This is what I told you about step loading. And if you look at the graph about the flow chart, you also understand that the two correlate. This is the path to progression. Whenever you go too high in intensity and anxiety or too low in under intensity, under volume and boredom, this is when progression goes astray. This is when you lose stability, and this is what we try to avoid as much as humanly possible. This is the Western school of training as opposed to the Eastern school of training that one could call the no pain, no gain school versus the flow state school. The first promotes going hard all the time, ignoring pain and toughing it out, which creates great mental fortitude, yes, but also filters the shit out of people because it destroys your longevity and it also destroys your ability to stay consistent. The second school, on the other hand, promotes patience, intelligent effort expenditure, and autoregulation, while the body dictates what the demands will be and not the other way around. So if we want to call it that, what I just explained to you, you do not go with an arbitrary number of sets or select a weight based on what you want to lift on that given day. You decide these variables based on what the body will need on that given day to be stimulated. Not more, not less. This is still relative to what you want, to how many days you're going to train, and how much fatigue you're willing to accumulate. And it also depends on what body part you train, because each body part is special. To understand this, you have to look at two factors. One, what muscle you are working, and two, what lifts you are going to use to work them. So for example, 3 sets of deadlifts to failure have a much higher chance of redlining the body and putting you above 85%, as opposed to 3 sets of curls still to failure, which are not going to really create any problem, because even though technically it's the same percentage, the same amount of sets, and maybe even the same reps, you understand that the amount of total fatigue you accumulate for both is completely different. This is why, as I said, it's all relative. I don't tell you to never go to failure, because there are certain lifts that you can go to failure on without actually having to pay any price. And this is explained by the scale on which the fatigue takes place. The more muscles a lift works, the more energy it requires, the more time it will take for you to recover, and therefore the more it tanks your recovery schedule and your ability to train frequently. So the more conservative you should be with them. To take again the example of deadlifts, if you do 5 hard sets of deadlifts to failure, there is a strong chance that you won't be able to deadlift or do heavy hip hinges again for at least a full week. So this means that you accumulated an amount of fatigue that the stimulus you received cannot justify. Again, you cannot justify in your training this amount of work, and therefore you should cut it down. So always keep in mind that not all percentages are born equal, and that intensity scales with the lift and the number of muscles it involves. Another good example would be to go back to the curls I just mentioned. Since a curl only involves the bicep, you can do 4 heavy sets to failure with no problem whatsoever, because you know that the only muscle that is getting worked is the bicep, which makes it much easier to schedule for recovery, and to know that, for example, within 3 days, you will be able to train the bicep again, because the total amount of fatigue accumulated is lesser. One would disturb the 85% rule a lot, the other one would only slightly disturb it, and therefore one must be avoided, and the other one can be embraced because it is much easier to justify that amount of work in your program. This is why small muscles, quote unquote, recover faster. It's because they rarely interact with other muscles. The more interaction the muscle gets, the stricter the application of the 85% rule has to be, the less interaction, the looser you can be. I say that to make sure that I don't end up with guys telling me, oh, can I go to failure on curls or shoulder raises? Yes, absolutely, as long as you apply this rule. But understand also that going to failure is not needed to gain muscle. Go back to what I said at the start. The goal is not to get to failure, it's to train in proximity to failure so as to experience maximum intensity. So if you can go to failure without paying an exorbitant price in terms of recovery, you can absolutely do it. So let's say, for example, that going to failure on squats means you can train legs again for a week. Then I would say, based on the 85% rule, that you shouldn't be doing it. But if going to failure on bench doesn't prevent you from training chest again or arms again within an acceptable time frame, I think that, again, based on the 85% rule, you should absolutely go for it. Again, it's all a question of balancing the budget and justifying what you do in the program. And as you can see, it's all fairly logical. The 85% rule allows you to streamline your program by giving you a framework in which to place your training. If anything sticks out, you can consider cutting it out. And if there is more space, you can consider adding more work. Keep in mind that this framework, again, varies from person to person and that it will grow with time, as your 85% of today is not your 85% of tomorrow. But if you keep matching that number while moving forward, you will see great results while also having a security system put in place to never go overboard or underboard. And that is that for this video presenting the 85% rule. I hope it was clear. I streamlined it as much as humanly possible, but as always, your body understands faster than your mind. So if you don't quite understand all the nitty-gritties, try to apply them in your training, and I guarantee you it's going to become much clearer. But I would recommend that you read the pinned comments several times, that you listen to the videos as many times as possible for you to understand, and again, that you first and foremost apply it to your training. Even if you fail, it doesn't matter. Failing is just another pathway towards success. And I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.